Captain Sarah Martinez stepped off the military transport helicopter onto the deck of the USS Constellation, her boots hitting the metal surface with a confidence that masked the nervous energy churning in her stomach. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, and the massive aircraft carrier felt both impressive and intimidating beneath her feet. At 32 years old, she was younger than most officers at her rank, and she knew that fact preceded her wherever she went. The salty breeze whipped through her dark hair as she surveyed her new assignment. This was the moment she had worked toward for over a decade, ever since graduating at the top of her class from the Naval Academy. But as she looked around at the seasoned faces of the crew members going about their duties, she could already sense the skeptical glances and whispered conversations that would follow her arrival. Commander James Peterson, the ship's executive officer, approached with a clipboard in hand and a barely concealed smirk on his weathered face. He had served on this vessel for 8 years and considered himself the unofficial guardian of its traditions and standards. His gray hair and lined face spoke of countless deployments and battles, and he had little patience for what he perceived as inexperienced officers being fast-tracked through the ranks. "Captain Martinez, welcome aboard," Peterson said, his tone professional but cool. "I trust your journey from Norfolk was comfortable. The crew is eager to meet their new commanding officer." The slight pause before the last 2 words didn't go unnoticed by Sarah, but she maintained her composure and extended her hand for a firm handshake. "Thank you, Commander Peterson. I'm looking forward to working with everyone and learning about the ship's operations," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the underlying tension she could feel building already. She had expected some resistance, but the barely concealed skepticism in Peterson's eyes told her that her reputation had preceded her in ways she hadn't anticipated. As they walked across the flight deck, Peterson began what was clearly a rehearsed tour, pointing out various features of the carrier with the air of someone who knew every bolt and rivet of the massive ship. Other crew members stopped their work to watch the new captain pass by, and Sarah could hear fragments of whispered conversations carried on the ocean breeze. "She looks barely old enough to be out of college," muttered Petty Officer Rodriguez to his colleague as they secured equipment near the aircraft elevator. "How does someone that young get command of a carrier?" "I heard she's some kind of computer whiz," replied Seaman Johnson, not bothering to lower his voice much. "Probably never seen real combat, just pushed buttons from a safe distance somewhere." Lieutenant Commander Ashley Thompson, the ship's operations officer, joined the tour group as they entered the superstructure. She had been serving in the Navy for 15 years and had worked her way up through sheer determination and skill. Thompson had applied for command positions twice and been passed over both times. So seeing someone younger taking the helm of one of the Navy's most prestigious vessels left her feeling bitter and resentful. "Captain Martinez," Thompson said with a tight smile, "I've prepared a detailed briefing on our current operational status. I thought you might need some time to familiarize yourself with how we run things here, given your diverse background." The emphasis on the last 2 words was subtle but clear, another reminder that Sarah's path to command had been different from the traditional route. Sarah nodded graciously, recognizing the veiled challenge in Thompson's words. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant Commander. I'm sure your experience will be invaluable as I get up to speed." She had learned long ago that rising to obvious bait would only confirm the suspicions of those who doubted her capabilities. The tour continued through the ship's various compartments, from the massive hangar deck where dozens of aircraft were maintained and stored, to the Combat Information Center where the ship's sophisticated radar and communication systems monitored thousands of square miles of ocean. Throughout the journey, Sarah observed not just the impressive technology and capabilities of the vessel, but also the dynamics among the crew members. She noticed how conversations seemed to pause when she approached, how certain officers exchanged meaningful glances when they thought she wasn't looking, and how the enlisted sailors seemed uncertain about how to interact with their new captain. It was clear that her appointment had been a topic of significant discussion long before her arrival. In the ship's conference room, Sarah met with the department heads for her first official briefing. The room was filled with experienced officers, most of whom had at least a decade more service time than their new commanding officer. The atmosphere was formal but tense, with everyone carefully measuring their words and reactions. Commander Peterson took the lead, outlining the ship's current mission parameters and recent operational history. As he spoke, Sarah could see the other officers watching her carefully, looking for signs of confusion or incompetence. She listened intently, asking pointed questions that demonstrated her understanding of naval operations and strategic thinking. "What's our current readiness status for emergency deployment?" Sarah asked, her question cutting through Peterson's detailed explanation of maintenance schedules. "We can be operational within 6 hours of receiving orders," replied Chief Engineer Maria Santos, one of the few officers who seemed genuinely neutral about the command change. "All systems are green, and we've just completed a major overhaul of our propulsion systems." "Excellent," Sarah said, making notes on her tablet. "And what about our air wing? I see we have a mix of FA-18 Super Hornets and some newer aircraft. How's pilot readiness?" This question was directed at Commander Michael Hayes, the Air Wing commander who had been notably silent throughout most of the briefing. Hayes was a decorated pilot with multiple combat deployments, and his reputation for excellence was matched only by his reputation for speaking his mind, regardless of rank or protocol. "Pilot readiness is high," Hayes answered carefully. "But integration with ship operations requires experience and trust between the air wing and ship's company. That kind of coordination takes time to develop." The implication was clear. He wasn't sure if Sarah had the experience necessary to effectively coordinate complex flight operations during critical missions. The briefing continued for nearly 2 hours, covering everything from weapons systems to supply logistics. Throughout the session, Sarah demonstrated a thorough understanding of naval operations and asked insightful questions that showed she had done her homework. However, she could still sense the underlying skepticism from most of the officers present. After the meeting, Sarah retreated to her quarters to review the massive amount of information she had received. Her cabin was spacious by naval standards, but felt cramped compared to the office she had occupied at her previous assignment in strategic planning. The walls were lined with monitors and communication equipment that kept her connected to the ship's operations around the clock. As she organized her notes and began developing her initial assessment of the ship's capabilities and crew dynamics, Sarah reflected on the challenges that lay ahead. She had faced skepticism before throughout her career, often being the youngest or least experienced person in leadership positions. But commanding an aircraft carrier was different from any previous assignment, with thousands of lives and billions of dollars in equipment under her responsibility. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, and Commander Peterson entered with a serious expression on his face. "Captain, I thought you should know that there's been some discussion among the crew about your appointment," Peterson said, his tone suggesting he was fulfilling an obligation rather than offering friendly advice. "Some of the more experienced personnel are concerned about serving under someone who hasn't commanded a ship before." Sarah looked up from her papers, meeting Peterson's gaze directly. "Commander, I appreciate your honesty. I'm sure the crew has questions about my qualifications and experience. I hope to address those concerns through my actions rather than my words." Peterson nodded stiffly. "Of course, Captain. I just thought you should be aware of the atmosphere among the crew. It may take some time for them to adjust to your leadership style." "I understand," Sarah replied. "Change is always difficult, especially in an environment where trust and teamwork are essential for mission success. I'm confident that we'll find a way to work together effectively." After Peterson left, Sarah returned to her analysis of the ship's operations, but her mind kept drifting to the challenges of earning the respect and trust of a crew that clearly had doubts about her abilities. She had worked twice as hard as her peers throughout her career to prove herself worthy of advancement, and she was prepared to do the same here. The next morning brought Sarah's first real test as commanding officer. During the pre-dawn watch, a routine training exercise had been scheduled to test the ship's response time and coordination between different departments. It was the kind of drill that had been conducted countless times before, but for Sarah it represented an opportunity to observe her crew in action and begin building the relationships that would be crucial for future success. As she entered the Combat Information Center, Sarah could feel the tension in the air. The watch officers went about their duties with professional efficiency, but she noticed how they seemed to be performing for her benefit rather than simply doing their jobs. Everyone was on their best behavior, which paradoxically made the atmosphere feel forced and artificial. "Captain on the bridge," announced the watch officer as Sarah moved to the command chair. The familiar ritual provided some comfort, but she could sense that the crew was still evaluating her every move and decision. The training exercise began with a simulated emergency that required rapid coordination between the ship's various departments. Sarah watched carefully as orders were given and executed, noting both the strengths and weaknesses in the crew's performance. Overall, the execution was competent, but lacked the seamless coordination that came from years of working together under experienced leadership. When the exercise concluded, Sarah gathered the department heads for a debrief session. Instead of immediately offering criticism or suggestions, she asked each officer to evaluate their department's performance and identify areas for improvement. The approach was collaborative rather than authoritative, demonstrating her preference for building consensus rather than simply issuing orders. "I think we can improve our communication protocols," offered Lieutenant Commander Thompson, somewhat reluctantly. There were a few moments where information didn't flow as quickly as it should have between departments. "I agree," said Commander Hayes from the Air Wing. "My pilots need clearer coordination with the ship's navigation team when we're conducting flight operations in challenging conditions." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, taking notes on each comment and suggestion. "These are all excellent observations. I'd like each department to develop specific recommendations for improving coordination and communication. We'll review them together next week and implement the best ideas." The collaborative approach seemed to catch some of the officers off guard, as they had apparently expected a more traditional command style, where the captain would dictate changes based on her own observations. However, Sarah's strategy was deliberate. She wanted to demonstrate that she valued their experience and expertise, while also establishing her authority through competent leadership rather than rank alone. Over the following days, Sarah made a point of being visible throughout the ship, talking with crew members at all levels and learning about their roles and responsibilities. She spent time in the engine room with the mechanics, observed flight operations from the deck, and even joined the mess hall line during meal times instead of eating in the officers' wardroom. These interactions gradually began to break down some of the initial barriers between Sarah and the crew. While many still harbored doubts about her qualifications, they started to recognize that she was genuinely interested in understanding their work and challenges. The informal conversations also gave Sarah valuable insights into the ship's operations that couldn't be gleaned from official reports and briefings. However, not everyone was warming up to their new commanding officer. A small group of senior enlisted personnel, led by Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Chen, remained openly skeptical about Sarah's ability to lead effectively during challenging situations. Chen had served on multiple deployments and had seen several commanding officers come and go, and he prided himself on being able to quickly assess a leader's capabilities. "She seems nice enough," Chen confided to his fellow chief petty officers during an informal gathering in their mess. "But being nice doesn't win battles or bring sailors home safely. We need someone who's been tested under fire, not someone who spent their career behind a desk pushing papers. These sentiments echoed throughout certain segments of the crew, particularly among those who had served multiple combat deployments and had strong opinions about what qualities were essential for effective leadership in dangerous situations. They weren't openly insubordinate, but their skepticism created an undercurrent of doubt that threatened to undermine unit cohesion when it would be needed most. Sarah was aware of these concerns, partly through formal channels and partly through the informal intelligence network that existed on any military vessel. She knew that earning the crew's full confidence would require more than just competent administration and friendly interactions. She would need to demonstrate leadership under pressure and prove that she could make the difficult decisions that command required. The opportunity for that demonstration would come sooner than anyone expected. The emergency klaxon shattered the calm morning routine aboard the USS Constellation, its urgent wailing echoing through every compartment of the massive carrier. Sarah bolted upright in her bunk, instantly alert despite having been asleep for only 3 hours after a late-night review of operational reports. The sound that every naval officer dreaded filled the air with its unmistakable message of immediate danger. "Captain to the bridge! Captain to the bridge immediately!" The ship's communication system crackled with barely controlled urgency. Sarah grabbed her uniform and was dressed within 90 seconds, her training taking over as she raced through the ship's corridors toward the command center. Crew members pressed against the bulkheads to let her pass, their faces reflecting the same tension and uncertainty that gripped everyone when real emergencies struck without warning. The bridge was a scene of controlled chaos when Sarah arrived, with officers and enlisted personnel manning their stations while Commander Peterson coordinated the initial response. The large tactical displays showed multiple contacts moving across the ocean surface, and the radio chatter indicated that several vessels were in distress somewhere in the ship's operational area. "Report," Sarah commanded as she took her position at the command station, her voice cutting through the ambient noise with calm authority, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Captain, we've received multiple Mayday calls from a civilian convoy approximately 40 nautical miles northeast of our current position," Peterson reported, his earlier skepticism temporarily set aside in the face of genuine crisis. 3 merchant vessels and a passenger ferry are reporting engine failures and taking on water after encountering severe weather conditions that weren't predicted by meteorological services. Sarah quickly absorbed the information while scanning the tactical displays that showed the positions of both her ship and the vessels in distress. The situation was complicated by the fact that the convoy was operating in international waters near a disputed territorial boundary, adding political considerations to what was already a complex rescue operation. "How many people are we talking about?" Sarah asked, her mind already working through the logistics of mounting a rescue operation while maintaining awareness of potential political and military complications. "Estimated 350 civilian passengers and crew across all 4 vessels," replied Lieutenant Commander Thompson, who was coordinating communications with the distressed ships. "The ferry is carrying mostly families traveling between islands, including approximately 60 children under the age of 12. The mention of children added urgency to an already critical situation, and Sarah could see the expectation in the eyes of her officers as they waited for her decision. This was exactly the kind of scenario that would test not only her technical competence, but also her judgment under pressure, with hundreds of lives potentially hanging in the balance. "What's our estimated time to reach the convoy?" Sarah asked the navigation officer, while simultaneously considering the various factors that would influence their response options. "At flank speed, approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes, Captain," came the immediate reply from Lieutenant Junior Grade Maria Gonzalez, who had been plotting courses and calculating distances since the first distress call arrived. Sarah nodded, then turned to the communications officer. "Get me a direct channel to Fleet Command. I need to report our intentions and get clearance for rescue operations in those waters." She paused, then added, Also contact the Coast Guard and any other naval vessels in the area to coordinate our response efforts." Commander Peterson stepped closer to Sarah, lowering his voice so that only she could hear his next words. "Captain, I should point out that those waters are currently subject to territorial disputes between 3 different nations. Moving into that area could create diplomatic complications that might affect our primary mission parameters." Sarah appreciated Peterson's concern, but the legal and political complexities seemed secondary to the immediate humanitarian crisis unfolding just beyond the horizon. "Commander, our primary mission is to preserve life and maintain freedom of navigation in international waters. I believe this situation falls squarely within those parameters." "Understood, Captain," Peterson replied, his tone suggesting he was beginning to see a different side of his commanding officer than the untested newcomer he had initially dismissed. The next hour was a whirlwind of activity as the USS Constellation changed course and increased speed toward the location of the distressed vessels. Sarah coordinated with multiple agencies and commands, balancing the immediate needs of the rescue operation with the broader strategic and political considerations that could affect the mission's success. The ship's medical department prepared to receive potential casualties, while the flight crews readied helicopters for search and rescue operations. The deck crews prepared small boats and rescue equipment, and the entire ship's company shifted into the heightened state of readiness that characterized military operations under real-world conditions. "Captain, we're receiving updated information from the convoy," Thompson reported from the communications station. "The weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly, with 20-foot seas and winds gusting up to 50 knots. 2 of the merchant vessels are now reporting critical engine damage and are beginning to list significantly." Sarah studied the weather data streaming onto her displays, noting that the storm system was larger and more intense than originally predicted. The combination of equipment failures and severe weather was creating a perfect storm of dangerous conditions that would challenge even experienced rescue teams. "How long before we have helicopters in the air?" Sarah asked Commander Hayes, who was coordinating the Air Wing's contribution to the rescue effort. 15 minutes for the first aircraft, Captain," Hayes replied with professional efficiency. "I'm launching 2 search and rescue birds initially, with 2 more ready to follow once we assess the situation on scene. Weather conditions are marginal for flight operations, but we can handle it." The confidence in Hayes' voice was reassuring, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes as he studied the meteorological reports. Helicopter operations in severe weather were inherently dangerous, and adding the complexity of rescue operations over rough seas would test the skills and courage of even the most experienced air crews. "Captain, we've got another complication," announced the tactical officer, pointing to his display screen where new contacts had appeared. "I'm tracking 2 vessels approaching the convoy area from the northwest. Speed and course suggest they're military vessels, possibly belonging to one of the nations claiming territorial rights in that region." Sarah moved to the tactical station to examine the new information, her mind racing through the potential implications of foreign military presence in the rescue area. The appearance of other naval vessels could complicate the rescue operation significantly, particularly if they challenge the USS Constellation's right to operate in those waters. "Can we identify the vessels?" Sarah asked, leaning over the tactical display to study the radar contacts that represented unknown ships moving toward the same location where hundreds of civilians desperately needed assistance. "Negative identification at this time, Captain," the tactical officer replied. "Range is too great for visual confirmation, and they're not responding to our radio queries. Based on size and speed characteristics, I estimate they're frigate or destroyer-class vessels." The situation was rapidly becoming more complex than a simple rescue operation, with potential military confrontation looming alongside the humanitarian crisis. Sarah knew that her decisions in the next few hours would be scrutinized not only by her own chain of command, but potentially by international observers and political leaders as well. Continue monitoring those contacts and keep me informed of any changes in their course or speed, Sarah ordered. I want to know immediately if they make any moves that could interfere with our rescue operations. The first helicopter launched from the flight deck precisely on schedule, its rotor wash creating spray patterns across the carrier's surface as it lifted off into the stormy sky. Sarah watched through the bridge windows as the aircraft disappeared into the gray clouds, carrying highly trained rescue swimmers and medical personnel toward what everyone hoped would be successful life-saving operations. 20 minutes later, the helicopter crew made contact with the convoy and began transmitting live video feeds back to the carrier. The images on the bridge displays showed the full extent of the crisis. Merchant ships listing heavily in mountainous seas, with passengers and crew members visible on deck wearing life preservers and preparing for potential evacuation. Captain, helicopter crew reports that the passenger ferry is in the most critical condition, Thompson announced, relaying information from the aircraft. They estimate it has maybe 30 minutes before it becomes uninhabitable. The crew is requesting immediate assistance with passenger evacuation. Sarah felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders as she processed the information and its implications. Hundreds of lives depended on her decisions and the effectiveness of her crew's response, while unknown military vessels approached the area with uncertain intentions. "How far out are those unidentified contacts?" Sarah asked the tactical officer, her voice remaining steady despite the mounting pressure of the developing situation. "Approximately 25 nautical miles and closing, Captain. Still no response to our identification requests, and their current course will put them in the rescue area within 45 minutes. Sarah turned to Commander Peterson, who had been monitoring multiple communication channels while coordinating with various shore-based agencies. "Commander, what's our status with Fleet Command regarding authorization for rescue operations in disputed waters?" "Still waiting for final confirmation, Captain," Peterson replied. "Initial indications are that we have authorization to proceed, but there are concerns about potential confrontation with foreign naval vessels operating in the same area." The bridge fell silent except for the constant background chatter of radio communications and the hum of electronic equipment. Every officer present understood that they were approaching a critical decision point where humanitarian concerns, military protocol, and political considerations would all factor into whatever course of action their commanding officer chose. Sarah looked around the bridge at the faces of her officers, seeing a mixture of concern, anticipation, and uncertainty reflected in their expressions. Some of the same people who had questioned her qualifications just days earlier were now looking to her for leadership in a situation that would challenge even the most experienced naval commander. "Gentlemen and ladies," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the bridge, "we have hundreds of civilians in immediate danger who need our help. Whatever political complications may arise from our response, I believe our duty is clear. We will proceed with rescue operations and deal with any challenges as they develop." Commander Hayes nodded approvingly from his position near the flight operations station. "Captain, my air crews are ready to launch additional helicopters on your order. Weather conditions are challenging but manageable for experienced pilots." "Launch the second wave," Sarah ordered without hesitation, "and prepare the ship's boats for potential close-range rescue operations if the weather permits. I want maximum flexibility in our response options." The energy on the bridge shifted perceptibly as the crew recognized that their commanding officer was committed to the rescue mission regardless of potential complications. Officers moved with renewed purpose, executing orders with the precision that came from knowing that lives depended on their professional competence. 30 minutes later, as rescue operations intensified around the distressed convoy, the tactical officer made an announcement that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. "Captain, the unidentified vessels have altered course and are now moving directly toward our position at high speed. I'm also detecting what appears to be weapons systems activation on the lead vessel." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she realized that what had begun as a rescue operation might be evolving into a potential military confrontation. The unknown vessels were clearly taking an aggressive posture, possibly challenging the USS Constellation's presence in waters they claimed as their territorial responsibility. "Signal General Quarters," Sarah ordered, her voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. "All hands to battle stations, but continue rescue operations unless directly threatened. I want our defensive systems ready, but not actively targeting the approaching vessels." The general quarters alarm sounded throughout the ship, and within minutes the USS Constellation had transformed from rescue vessel to warship ready for combat. However, Sarah's orders ensured that rescue helicopters continued their life-saving work, while the ship prepared to defend itself and the civilians it was trying to save. As the bridge crew monitored both the rescue operations and the approaching military vessels, Sarah stood at the center of command, making rapid decisions that would determine not only the success of the humanitarian mission, but potentially the safety of her own ship and crew. The true test of her leadership was just beginning. The tension on the bridge of the USS Constellation reached a breaking point as the unknown military vessels closed to within 15 nautical miles, their intentions still unclear, but their aggressive posture unmistakable. Sarah stood at the command station, surrounded by the soft glow of tactical displays and the quiet efficiency of her crew operating at general quarters, knowing that her next decisions would determine the fate of hundreds of civilians and potentially create an international incident. "Captain, lead vessel is hailing us on international emergency frequencies," announced the communications officer, his voice tight with the stress of managing multiple radio channels simultaneously. "They're identifying themselves as the destroyer Shangwei of the People's Liberation Army Navy, demanding that we cease operations and withdraw from what they claim are Chinese territorial waters." Sarah absorbed this information while simultaneously monitoring the rescue operations that continued around the distressed civilian vessels. Her helicopters had successfully evacuated nearly 200 passengers from the sinking ferry, but another 150 people remained scattered across the 3 merchant ships, which were fighting their own battles against the increasingly severe weather conditions. "How do they justify territorial claims over international waters?" Sarah asked her navigation officer, though she already suspected the answer would involve the complex web of disputed territorial boundaries that had been a source of regional tension for decades. "Captain, according to our charts and international maritime law, we're operating in clearly defined international waters," Lieutenant Gonzalez replied with confidence. "However, the Chinese have made expansive territorial claims in this region that aren't recognized by most other nations or international maritime organizations." Commander Peterson moved closer to Sarah, speaking quietly so his words wouldn't carry to the rest of the bridge crew. "Captain, we're in a very delicate situation here. If we refuse their demands, we could be facing a military confrontation while conducting rescue operations. But if we withdraw, those civilians will almost certainly die." Sarah nodded, understanding the impossible position they faced. Military protocol suggested avoiding confrontation when possible. But humanitarian law and basic human decency demanded that they continue saving lives regardless of political complications. The weight of command had never felt heavier than it did at this moment. "Open a channel to the Shangwei," Sarah ordered, her decision made. "I want to speak directly with their commanding officer." The radio crackled to life as communications were established between the 2 warships, their crews separated by miles of rough ocean, but connected by the ancient maritime traditions that governed interactions between naval vessels. The voice that came through the speakers was professional but firm, speaking heavily accented English with the authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "American vessel, this is Captain Liu Wei of the People's Liberation Army Navy destroyer Shangwei. You are conducting unauthorized military operations in Chinese territorial waters. You will cease these operations immediately and withdraw to a distance of no less than 50 nautical miles from this position." Sarah picked up the radio handset, her voice steady and diplomatic despite the circumstances. "Captain Liu, this is Captain Sarah Martinez of the United States Navy carrier USS Constellation. We are conducting humanitarian rescue operations in international waters to save civilian lives in immediate danger. We have no hostile intentions toward your vessel or your nation." A pause followed Sarah's transmission, during which she could imagine Captain Liu conferring with his officers about how to respond to what was clearly not the answer he had expected or desired. The tactical displays showed that the Chinese destroyer had been joined by a second vessel, creating an even more complex military situation around the ongoing rescue operations. "Captain Martinez," Liu's voice returned with increased firmness, "you will withdraw immediately or face the consequences of illegal operations in sovereign Chinese waters. This is your final warning." The bridge fell silent as everyone processed the unmistakable threat contained in the Chinese captain's words. Sarah looked around at her officers, seeing a mixture of apprehension and determination in their faces. These were professional naval officers who understood the risks of their chosen career, but none had expected to face potential combat while trying to save civilian lives. "Captain," Commander Hayes reported from the Flight Operations Station, "our helicopters are reporting that the weather is deteriorating rapidly, sea conditions are becoming marginal for safe rescue operations, and we're running out of time to evacuate the remaining civilians." The meteorological reports confirmed Hayes' assessment, showing that the storm system was intensifying much faster than originally predicted. Wind speeds were approaching 60 knots, with wave heights exceeding 25 feet in the rescue area. Within another hour, helicopter operations would become impossible, regardless of the military situation. Sarah made a decision that would define not only her command, but potentially her entire career. "Continue rescue operations," she announced clearly enough for everyone on the bridge to hear. "All available aircraft and rescue teams are to maintain their current missions. We will not abandon civilians in distress regardless of political pressure or military threats." The effect of Sarah's words on her crew was immediate and visible. Officers who had questioned her qualifications just days earlier now looked at her with something approaching respect, recognizing that she was willing to risk her career and potentially her ship to save innocent lives. The skepticism that had characterized many interactions since her arrival was replaced by a sense of shared purpose and determination. "Captain," the tactical officer called out urgently, "the Chinese destroyer is increasing speed and changing course to intercept our rescue helicopters. I'm also detecting fire control radar actively scanning our aircraft." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she realized that the situation was escalating beyond diplomatic protests into potential military action. The Chinese were clearly prepared to use force to stop the rescue operations, creating a scenario where American military personnel could come under attack while trying to save civilian lives. "Signal the helicopter crews to be prepared for evasive action, but do not suspend rescue operations unless directly fired upon," Sarah ordered. "Also prepare our defensive systems to protect our aircraft if necessary." Commander Peterson approached Sarah again, his expression grave. "Captain, I have to point out that if we engage Chinese naval vessels, even in defense of our rescue operations, we could be starting a much larger conflict than anyone anticipated." "I understand the risks, Commander," Sarah replied firmly. "But I also understand that we took an oath to protect innocent life and maintain freedom of navigation in international waters. I will not back down from either of those responsibilities." The tactical displays suddenly erupted with new activity as the Chinese destroyer increased speed to flank and began maneuvering aggressively near the rescue area. Sarah could see that Captain Liu was testing her resolve, probably hoping that the threat of military action would force the Americans to withdraw and abandon the rescue mission. "Captain, our lead helicopter is reporting direct radio contact from the Chinese destroyer," Thompson announced from the communications station. "They're ordering our aircraft to leave the area immediately or face defensive action." Sarah grabbed the radio handset again, this time addressing not just Captain Liu, but potentially recording a message that would be heard by naval commanders and political leaders around the world. "Captain Liu, the United States Navy will continue rescue operations to save civilian lives in international waters. Any interference with humanitarian operations will be considered a hostile act." The response came not through radio communications, but through actions that spoke louder than words. The Chinese destroyer suddenly changed course and increased speed, moving directly toward the position where American helicopters were evacuating passengers from the sinking ferry. The tactical displays showed the warship on a collision course with the rescue area, clearly intent on disrupting the operation through intimidation or force. "Captain, the destroyer Shangwei is approaching our helicopter operations area at high speed," the tactical officer reported, with barely controlled alarm in his voice. "If they maintain current course and speed, they'll reach our aircraft positions in less than 8 minutes. Sarah faced the most critical decision of her naval career, with hundreds of civilian lives hanging in the balance and the potential for military confrontation looming just minutes away. She looked around the bridge at officers who had doubted her abilities just hours earlier, but now waited for her orders with complete attention and growing confidence. "All stations." "This is the captain," Sarah announced over the ship's general communication system, her voice carrying to every compartment of the massive carrier. "We are faced with a situation where we must choose between political convenience and saving innocent lives. I choose to save lives. All personnel will continue their assigned duties with the knowledge that we are doing what's right, regardless of the consequences." The effect of this announcement rippled through the ship as thousands of crew members understood that their commanding officer was willing to risk everything to maintain their mission of humanitarian rescue. In the engine rooms, mechanics worked harder to maintain maximum power. On the flight deck, aircraft handlers prepared additional helicopters for launch. Throughout the ship, sailors who had questioned their captain's qualifications now saw leadership under pressure that exceeded anything they had previously experienced. "Captain, helicopter crews report they've evacuated all passengers from the ferry just as it finally capsized," Hayes announced with obvious relief. "However, we still have approximately 120 people scattered across the 3 merchant vessels, and weather conditions are making rescue operations increasingly dangerous." The tactical situation became even more complex as the Chinese destroyer closed to within 3 nautical miles of the rescue area, its weapons systems clearly visible and its intentions unmistakably aggressive. Sarah knew that Captain Liu was testing not only her resolve, but also the broader American commitment to freedom of navigation and humanitarian operations in contested waters. "Signal our helicopters to continue rescue operations, but maintain maximum situational awareness," Sarah ordered. "If the Chinese vessel makes any overtly hostile moves toward our aircraft, I want immediate notification." At that moment, the radio crackled to life with an unexpected transmission that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. "USS Constellation, this is Her Majesty's ship Birmingham, requesting permission to join rescue operations. We are a Royal Navy destroyer currently 12 nautical miles southeast of your position and ready to provide assistance." Sarah felt a surge of relief as she realized that other naval forces had responded to the emergency, potentially creating a multinational rescue operation that would be much more difficult for the Chinese to interfere with. The arrival of British naval forces would transform the situation from a bilateral confrontation into a broader international incident. "HMS Birmingham, this is USS Constellation. We welcome your assistance with rescue operations. Please be advised that Chinese naval vessels are attempting to interfere with humanitarian efforts in international waters. The British destroyer captain's response was immediate and decisive. Understood, Constellation. Birmingham will support rescue operations and ensure freedom of navigation in international waters. We have additional helicopters and rescue equipment standing by. Within minutes, British helicopters appeared on the tactical displays, approaching the rescue area from a different direction and effectively doubling the available aircraft for evacuating civilians from the distressed merchant vessels. The Chinese destroyer suddenly found itself outnumbered and facing a multinational humanitarian coalition rather than a single American vessel. Captain Liu's response to this development revealed the effectiveness of Sarah's decision to maintain rescue operations despite threats. Rather than escalate further against multiple naval forces from different nations, the Chinese destroyer reduced speed and took a less aggressive posture. Apparently recognizing that interfering with an international rescue operation would create diplomatic complications far beyond the original territorial dispute. Captain, our helicopter crews report successful evacuation of all remaining civilians from the merchant vessels, Commander Hayes announced with obvious satisfaction. Total rescued, 347 passengers and crew, with only minor injuries reported among the evacuees. The bridge erupted in quiet but unmistakable celebration, as officers who had spent hours under extreme tension finally allowed themselves to acknowledge the successful completion of their mission. Sarah felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment, knowing that her decisions had saved hundreds of lives while maintaining American principles of freedom of navigation and humanitarian responsibility. Over the following hours, as rescued civilians were transferred to appropriate medical care and the international naval forces coordinated their withdrawal from the area, the atmosphere aboard the USS Constellation underwent a complete transformation. Officers and crew members who had initially questioned Sarah's qualifications now spoke in respectful tones about her leadership under pressure. Commander Peterson approached Sarah as she reviewed after-action reports in her cabin that evening. "Captain, I owe you an apology," he said with genuine humility. "I made assumptions about your abilities based on your background, rather than giving you the chance to demonstrate your leadership. What you did today was exceptional command under the most challenging circumstances." Similar conversations took place throughout the ship, as crew members who had harbored doubts about their young commanding officer processed what they had witnessed during the rescue operation. Master Chief Chen, who had been among the most vocal skeptics, made a point of telling his fellow enlisted personnel that Captain Martinez had earned their complete respect and confidence. The official recognition of Sarah's performance came 3 weeks later when she was summoned to fleet headquarters for what she expected might be a reprimand for risking international confrontation. Instead, she found herself facing a promotion board that had reviewed her handling of the rescue operation and determined that her leadership merited immediate advancement. "Captain Martinez," the Admiral presiding over the board announced formally, "your decisive action in saving civilian lives while maintaining American principles under extreme pressure demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership the Navy needs in today's complex operating environment. It is my privilege to inform you that you have been selected for promotion to Rear Admiral and assignment as Commander of Carrier Battle Group 7. The irony was not lost on Sarah that the same officers who had questioned her qualifications to command a single aircraft carrier were now entrusting her with responsibility for an entire battle group consisting of multiple ships and thousands of personnel. The rescue operation had not only saved civilian lives, but had also proven that effective leadership came not from traditional career paths, but from the ability to make difficult decisions under pressure while maintaining moral and ethical principles. 6 months later, Admiral Sarah Martinez stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching a routine training exercise designed to test multi-ship coordination and combat readiness. The same officers who had once whispered about her lack of traditional experience now competed for assignments in her battle group. recognizing that she offered a different kind of leadership that emphasized both professional competence and humanitarian values. The transformation was complete when Commander Peterson, who had requested transfer to serve as her chief of staff, approached with the morning briefing materials. "Admiral, the exercise results show significant improvement in coordination between all units. I believe your emphasis on collaborative decision-making has enhanced overall effectiveness across the entire battle group." Sarah smiled as she reviewed the reports, remembering the skeptical faces that had greeted her arrival just months earlier. The rescue operation had taught her that earning respect required more than rank or credentials. It demanded the courage to make difficult decisions based on principles rather than convenience, and the wisdom to trust in the professionalism and dedication of the people under her command. The nickname that her crew had given her, the Admiral who chose lives over politics, had spread throughout the fleet and became a symbol of the kind of leadership that prioritized humanitarian values alongside military effectiveness. What had begun as a test of her qualifications had evolved into a defining moment that established her reputation as one of the Navy's most respected commanders. As she watched her ships execute complex maneuvers with precision and coordination that exceeded previous standards, Admiral Martinez understood that the greatest victory of her career had not been military, but moral, proving that doing the right thing, even under the most challenging circumstances, was always the foundation of true leadership.